Imagine it's Christmas Eve in Ontario. The whole family's gathered around the table. The prime ribs just come out of the oven, and my son-in-law leans back in his chair, swirls his wine, and says, "Look, we've been talking about this for a while now. You've had a good run here, but honestly, you're dragging us down. We need you out by New Year's." I put down my fork, didn't say a word, just looked at my daughter. She wouldn't meet my eyes. That was the moment I understood everything. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. It helps more than you know. My name is Don. Wait, no, I'll come back to who I am. What matters right now is what I was holding in my hands at that table. 41 years of receipts, in a manner of speaking. Not literally. I'm not the kind of man who carries paper everywhere. But I know numbers. I spent 34 years as a journeyman electrician in the Niagara region, and electricians do not make mistakes with measurements. We cannot afford to. My daughter, I'll call her that, just that, because her name doesn't matter as much as what she did, is 36. Her husband is 40. They bought their house in Welland 4 years ago, a century home with knob and wiring that nobody had touched since Trudeau's first government. When the home inspector's report came back, my son-in-law called me from the driveway of the house, voice tight, already calculating retreat. "It's going to cost 40, maybe 50,000 to rewire the whole place," he said. I told him I'd take care of it. I want to be clear about what that meant. I didn't hand them a check. I showed up. Every Saturday Sunday for 4 months, I drove the 40 minutes from my place in St. Catharines, brought my own tools, pulled wire, replaced panels, brought the whole house up to ESA standards. I called in favors from 2 guys I'd worked with for decades, and I paid them out of my own pocket because they had families and couldn't afford to donate their weekends. Materials alone came to $18,000. Labor, if you priced it commercially, would have run another 35. I never sent an invoice. That's not how I was raised. My wife Gwen had died 14 months before that. Ovarian cancer. Fast and merciless. She was here in April and gone by July, and I spent the following winter in a house that felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. When my daughter called in October and said they needed help with the rewiring, I think I said yes before she'd finished the sentence. I needed somewhere to put my hands. After the rewiring was done, it made sense, their words, not mine, for me to just stay on. They had the spare room. I was alone. The grandchildren, 7 and 4 at the time, had started calling me every day. My son-in-law said, and I remember this precisely because I replayed it many times later, "You're part of the team now, Dad." That was 2 years ago. I paid $1,200 a month toward their mortgage. Not because they asked, because I offered, and because it seemed right. I covered the property tax installment in March, when their line of credit was maxed from the kitchen renovation. I bought a new furnace in February after the old one quit at 2 in the morning during a cold snap that dropped to -28. $8,000 installed, because I wasn't going to let my grandchildren sleep in a cold house. I took both kids to their appointments when my daughter was supply teaching and my son-in-law was traveling for work. I made dinner 4 nights a week. I shoveled the walk every morning it snowed. I thought this was what family looked like. The first sign I missed or chose not to see came in October. My son-in-law had started doing this thing at dinner, where he'd answer my questions with 1 word and then turn back to his phone. My daughter had started having long conversations in their room with the door closed, going quiet when I walked past. I told myself they were stressed. The mortgage rate had renewed higher. His commission had been soft. I gave them an extra $500 that month without being asked. Didn't mention it, just transferred it. Christmas Eve. The prime rib had cost me $60 at the butcher on King Street. I'd been marinating it since the 22nd. My granddaughter had made a card for me with her name spelled wrong and a drawing of the 2 of us holding hands in the snow. It was in my shirt pocket. My son-in-law put down his wine glass. "We've been talking to someone," he said. "A family therapist, and she's helped us realize that the living arrangement has created some unhealthy dynamics." I looked at my daughter. She was cutting her meat into very small pieces. "What unhealthy dynamics?" I said. "You have a tendency to make decisions for the household. The furnace, the tax payment. We never asked you to do those things. It creates an imbalance of power. I was trying to help. We know that, but the help has strings, and we need to establish our own identity as a family unit without a parental presence in the home full-time. I sat with that for a moment. The grandfather clock in their front hallway, the one I'd restored for them as a birthday gift the previous spring, spent 3 weekends on the movement, ticked steadily. My granddaughter was arranging her peas by color. My grandson had gone very still in the way children do when they sense the weather changing. "When?" I said. My son-in-law looked surprised I wasn't arguing. "We were thinking New Year's would give you time to." I meant, when did I become a problem? Neither of them answered. I folded my napkin, set it on the table, picked up my granddaughter's card from my shirt pocket and looked at it for a second. Then I put it back, stood up, and said I was going to lie down. I didn't have the energy for the version of the conversation they'd rehearsed. I lay on the bed in the spare room and stared at the ceiling. The room still had the curtains Gwen and I had brought from St. Catherine's when I moved in. She'd bought them in Niagara-on-the-Lake the summer before she got sick. I'd hung them here because they were the last thing she chose. I lay there listening to the murmur of voices downstairs, my daughters raised briefly and then dropping again, and I thought about a lot of things. Gwen mostly. What she would have. She had a directness that I always envied, a way of cutting to the center of something without cruelty. She would have been furious, but Shosola would have told me not to make decisions in the dark. I got up at midnight. The house was quiet. I went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at the cabinet hardware I'd installed in August because my daughter said the old poles looked dated, and the tile backsplash I'd grouted on a long weekend in May. I wasn't cataloging grievances. I was just looking at the work. I've always understood things better when I can see them. I went back upstairs and I packed one bag. Not everything, just enough for a week or two, the way you pack when you're not sure of the timeline. Work shirts, my father's wristwatch, a few tools I kept in the closet out of habit, Gwen's photo from the nightstand. I left the curtains. I was gone before 7 in the morning. Left a note on the counter that said, "I'll arrange to collect the rest of my things in the new year. Merry Christmas. I love the kids." It was -15 on the 406 heading back to St. Catherine's. I had my hazards on for the first few kilometers before I noticed and turned them off. I called my friend from work, a man who'd pulled wire beside me for 20 years, and he picked up on the second ring, no hesitation, told me to come straight to his place. I spent Christmas on a fold-out couch watching hockey and eating leftovers and saying very little. His wife kept refilling my coffee without being asked. That was kindness. I recognized it because it had become unfamiliar. Boxing Day, I called a lawyer. Not out of anger. I want to be clear about that, because I've thought about the sequence of it many times. I called a lawyer because I'm 63 years old and I have a pension, a modest RRSP and some savings. And for the first time in 2 years I understood that I had no protection in place. I hadn't formalized anything. There was no paper trail, or rather, there was, in my own records, but nothing signed, nothing legal, nothing that said what the arrangement had been. The lawyer's name was Halverson. She practiced out of an office on St. Paul Street and she specialized, her website said, in family law and elder financial matters. I sat across from her on the 27th and she let me talk for 40 minutes without interrupting, which I appreciated. The money you contributed, the mortgage payments, the furnace, the materials. "Do you have records?" she asked. I pulled out the folder I'd brought. Bank statements going back to when I moved in. The ESA permit from the rewiring. Receipts from the supply house organized by date. The invoice from the HVAC company, paid in full, in my name. She looked through it without expression, the way experienced people look at things that don't surprise them. "You have a strong paper trail," she said. "Whether there's a legal claim depends on how the contributions were characterized at the time. Did anyone ever call them a loan? No. Did you? No. Then proving unjust enrichment is more complex, but not impossible." She explained the options. A formal demand letter, a civil claim for unjust enrichment under Ontario law, or a negotiated repayment agreement. She also asked about the labor, the rewiring, the weeks of work. I hadn't thought of that. She said that if I could document the hours and the commercial rate, it formed part of the picture. I went home, to my friend's spare room which had become my home for now, and I did the math on a notepad. Mortgage contributions over 22 months, $26,400. Furnace, $8,000. Property tax, $4,200. Materials for the rewiring, $18,000. My labor and that of the two men I'd paid. I was conservative. I used the ESA journeyman rate of $85 an hour and rounded down. The number that came out at the bottom of the page was not a small number. I put the notepad down and called my son. He lives in Calgary, works in energy, has 3 kids of his own, and a marriage that seems genuinely happy. We'd never been as close as I'd wanted, partly geography, partly personality. He's quieter than me, keeps things internal. But when I told him what had happened, told him calmly, because I'd had 4 days to settle into it by then, he was quiet for a long time. "Dad," he said finally, "I'm sorry." "You don't need to be sorry." "No, I'm sorry because I wondered if this was coming and I didn't say anything." He said some things at Thanksgiving that I should have pushed back on. That surprised me. I asked what things. He said my son-in-law had made some comments about the arrangement being unbalanced and about my being a bit much around the house. My son had told himself it was just venting. "I should have called you," he said. "Yes," I said, "you should have." But I didn't say it harshly. I understood it. We're not a family that talks directly about difficult things, or we weren't, we're learning. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in the north end of St. Catharines in the second week of January. Ground floor, older building, sensible rent, a garage bay included in the lease where I could set up a proper workspace. The super showed me the electrical panel when I asked, and I told him it needed work. He said if I fixed it, he'd take 3 months off the deposit. We shook hands. I had somewhere to put my hands again. My daughter called 7 times in the first 2 weeks. I let them all go to voicemail, not to punish her. I genuinely did not know what to say, and I didn't want to say the wrong thing while I was still raw. The messages evolved. The first few were formal, almost scripted. Around the 5th one, her voice changed. She cried. She said the kids were asking where I was. She said my son-in-law felt terrible. I didn't know if that was true, but I noted it. The lawyer sent a formal demand letter on January 19th. I hadn't decided to pursue the full claim. I told her I wanted to see how they responded to the letter first. It outlined the contributions, attached the documentation, and requested a meeting to discuss resolution. Nothing threatening. So my son-in-law called me within 24 hours, I answered. "I didn't realize you'd kept records of everything," he said. "I'm an electrician," I said. "Documentation is how people don't get hurt." Silence. "How much are we talking about?" he said. "Realistically, I don't know yet. That depends on the conversation." He wanted to meet without lawyers. I said I'd think about it. I talked to Halverson, who said I could do that if I wanted, but to bring my records and not to agree to anything on the spot. I said that sounded like how I'd always done business. We met at a Tim Hortons on a Tuesday afternoon, which I found appropriately unromantic. My son-in-law came alone. He'd aged in the few weeks since Christmas, or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. The executive affect was gone. He looked like a man who'd done a calculation and didn't like the result. He started to say something about the therapist again, about how she'd helped them understand, and I stopped him. "I don't want to talk about the therapist," I said. "I want to talk about the furnace." He blinked. "You have 2 children who sleep in that house," I said. "I paid for the furnace because I wasn't going to let my grandchildren be cold. That's not an imbalance of power. That's a grandfather, and if you can't tell the difference, that's a problem I can't fix for you." He didn't say anything for a while. He turned his coffee cup around in his hands. "I made a mistake," he said finally. "The way I said it on Christmas Eve. The timing, all of it. Yes, your daughter didn't know I was going to do it that night. She thought we were going to talk to you together in January, calmly. I sat with that. I believed him, actually. It tracked with what I knew of her. 'What do you want to happen?' he asked. 'I want my grandchildren in my life. I want to see them regularly, on a schedule, without it depending on whether we're getting along. I want a clear arrangement in writing. Not a legal document necessarily, but something we've both agreed to.' and I want to be repaid for the furnace. Not the labor, not the mortgage payments. Just the furnace, because that was a significant expense and it was a decision made under pressure, and I had no say in whether I'd ever see that money. He nodded. 8,460. Installed. I have the invoice. He almost smiled at that, not warmly, but something in him seemed to recognize it. I can do that, he said. It'll take a few months. I'm not in a hurry, I said. I'm in my apartment, I have time. My daughter came to see me the following week. She stood in the doorway of my new place and looked at the Gwen's curtains I'd finally gone back to collect, hung in the living room window, and she started crying before she'd said anything. I let her in. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and she told me about the therapist and the things that had apparently been building for months without her telling me, and I told her about the drive home on Christmas morning with my hazards on. I'm not sure why I told her that detail. Maybe because it was the truest thing I could think of. I didn't know he was going to do it that night, she said. I know. I should have stopped him. Yes, I said. You should have. She said she was sorry. I believed her. Apologies mean different things at different times. Hers meant, I see what happened, and I was part of it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That was enough. That was actually quite a lot. We didn't rush anything. That's the thing they don't tell you about repair. It doesn't happen in a conversation. It happens in the accumulation of small things. A call on a Thursday for no reason. A text with a photo of my granddaughter's lost tooth. My son-in-law dropping off the first payment on the furnace in an envelope with a short handwritten note that said, "For what it's worth, I'm working on it." I put the note in a drawer. I don't know why. I just didn't want to throw it away. In February, my daughter asked if I wanted to come to my granddaughter's skating lesson on Saturday morning. I said yes. I sat in the cold arena with a terrible coffee and watched my granddaughter fall down 6 times and get up 6 times. And on the 7th she stayed up and made it around the full rink, and she looked for me in the stands and waved with her whole arm. I waved back with my whole arm. My son-in-law was there too. We stood beside each other at the boards and watched. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. There's a version of repair that's very quiet. Not resolution exactly. More like the moment when the pipes stop knocking after a hard winter. The problem isn't gone, but something has settled. I go back to Gwen sometimes in my head, in the way you do when you're trying to figure out what the right thing is. She would have been less patient than me. She would have said what she thought in the moment and dealt with the fallout faster. But she also would have understood, I think, why I sat on the bed that Christmas Eve and didn't fight. Some fights you win by leaving the room. Some things only become clear once you're standing outside them in the cold. I'm still in my apartment in the North End. I've got the shop set up the way I want it. I volunteer 3 mornings a week at a community skills center in town, teaching basic electrical and home repair to adults who are trying to get their bearings. New Canadians, people between jobs, a few retired guys who just want to learn something. I'm not sure I've ever been better at anything than I am at explaining to a person how something works, why it matters, and what happens if you skip the steps. My grandson starts Timbits hockey in March. I'll be in the stands. That's not a small thing. In fact, if you've been paying attention, you know it's the whole point.